Hey, everybody. I'd love to introduce Christoph Kirst from University of California, San Francisco, and he studies networks, especially the nastiest networks, such as the brain. Welcome.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me here for this talk series. That seems quite interesting. I looked up in the internet a bit. It was quite interesting list of speakers, so I feel quite honored to give a presentation here of some of my work. I'm Christoph Kirst. I'm running a lab for computational neuroscience, mainly at UCSF, but I also have a position at the Berkeley lab, just behind the UC Berkeley campus. And my lab works like as many computational neuroscience groups, works on the quite difficult question of understanding this complex system brain. And maybe there are, if you want, there are two components that contribute to these quite impressive abilities that our brains actually have in recognizing things or generating very sophisticated behavior. Me generating this talk, not sure if it's that sophisticated, but all these things are generated by our brain, and there are two parts that maybe are worth studying. One is based more here on the left side, that is about brain structure, where we actually work a lot to understand brain structure on the systems level. So how are areas connected, how are neurons distributed over the entire system to better understand also these dynamics here. These are our data on the left from our clearing method, which we published quite a lot. Here is data from one of my collaborators, Ali Pasha Waziri from Rockefeller, where they record using calcium imaging about 1 million neurons at a time here. So these are like quite big data sets of neural activity. And of course, the structure and brain activity interact in some smart way to generate behavior down here, where I also have a video from another collaborator from the Magnoli lab at UCSF, where we, in this case here, do a lot of video processing, posture detection, and then try to understand, in this case, particularly the interactions between these animals over here. So my lab kind of works in all these fields to some extent, providing like computational tools and also theory about brain structure. The ultimate goal, of course, of all neuroscience and particular computational neuroscience is to better understand how do these circuits use dynamics to compute things and generate like this sophisticated behavior. Yeah, I just for reference, we have quite a lot of different works in this area. In the complex brain structure, we do like analyze huge data sets, large data sets, let's say, from clear tissue, where we have our software here, ClearMap, that's quite widely used. And I invite you to look up those results. They're quite interesting. We work, as I said, on behavioral dynamics, where we initially worked with worms and monitoring for a long time. And now we switched here to these interacting pre-walls that have quite interesting social behavior in contrast, for example, to mice or rats. And then here on the other part is our theory part, where we try to better understand network dynamics. And I will talk about the right-hand side today in more detail. So let me briefly introduce the general topic or the general setting in some sense. So I'm not so sure about all your people's background, but in the simple setting, we can consider that maybe the brain is focusing computations on the neurons. That's one big paradigm that's maybe overthrown these days a bit, and also people look at other cells like astrocytes, etc. But the general theory is that neurons are the main main substrate on which computations are done, and these neurons, they generate electric pulses and then transfer them to other neurons and connect via spikes or action potentials. And then if you couple them together in networks, you get, of course, a very interesting complex dynamics of these networks, and some simple dynamical states you can observe is maybe synchronization, so everything synchronizes. You don't really want that in a brain, often connected with diseases like, for example, elliptic seizures or a tremor in Parkinson's disease. So those synchronization states are maybe not as optimal all the time. You get other interesting dynamics. I might mention some in the rest of the talk. Now, these dynamics have to generate function somehow. And here I just show a very simple example how you can use dynamical states in this case to generate certain functions. So assume you have some sort of asynchronous state. Here we have a raster plot, so this is time, and here on the y-axis, these are different neurons. Whenever a neuron is generating one of these action potentials I mentioned before, we make a line here, so this indicates basically the activity of the neurons. So here they fire asynchronously, they don't spike together, and let's say this network here kind of projects on a postsynaptic neuron and indicated in red. But because they all spike not very regularly, there's some small effect here on this neuron. And if it's not like a perfect integrator, it will basically not respond to this. However, if you let's say, switch to a synchronous state where all these spikes are aligned, same setting as before, nothing changed in the physical structure, you get like output spikes easily. So in this case, you can do some single gating by controlling the synchrony of your circuit, for example. And as we will see in this talk also, but also other people have contributed largely to that, that can also be used to do information routing, and then of course information processing, and then higher order processes and cognitive processes and so on, and generate this complex behavior in some way. The gap here is probably pretty large still in our understanding of what the brain is doing. But yeah, we're working on it. So yeah, now you can take this backwards, so to say. As I said, the dynamical state in some way is highly affecting the function of the circuit. So there's this dynamical state dependency. And that can be influenced by many factors if you go back down to the neuron level. So of course you can change connections via plasticity if you wanted to. There are entire neuromodulatory systems that are very interesting to look at that change basically the dynamical properties of the individual neurons, but then ultimately may also change the brain state here, the dynamical state. These are all interesting mechanisms, and we have worked on these partly to some extent. But today, as I said before, I want to focus here mostly on not caring so much how the dynamical states are generated in the first place, but more seeing how can we use dynamical state dependency to do something interesting in these networks. So as I said, with this initial example, you can get these gating effects, and you can see those in the practical application here from a picture by Giuseppe Acrimboldi. You have maybe seen, you can see that in the Louvre, I think, if you want to have a look in real. If you look at it at first glance, if it was just flashed very quickly, most people will probably detect the face over here initially, but then if you look closer, you also see that it made of individual fruits, and you can kind of move your attention to identify the various fruits or go back to recognize it as a face. And these mechanisms are quite fast in how you interpret a scene in this case. So yeah, these kind of ways of moving around attention is kind of a fast way of, we can interpret this as a fast way of routing information in different ways in the system. And people have measured that. So in this case, it's a different pictures were presented here. But in this study here, fMRI study, that's typically the best people can do for humans, unless they are patients and you have some more sophisticated data. But this is enough to illustrate the fact. People here were shown different images. And then, for example, some images had very emotional content, and you would find, like, with some analysis I will describe maybe later too, that some of information here is flowing from earlier visual areas to like higher order areas like amygdala that is known to be involved in emotional processing. While in other situations, for beautiful faces, etc., you might see actually different ways of how this information, and these numbers here, don't worry about it, they mean certain things, but you can interpret this as kind of information flow. So for other context, other images presented, this information is now rerouted to a different area that seems to be better suited to process that information. And things can, of course, always go wrong if you don't have certain routing mechanisms in place. People sometimes even not able to detect the face. I'm sorry, detect the face here in these pictures. So here it's back to these pictures. People were shown these pictures, and people with certain diseases, they cannot recognize faces because some of these routing mechanisms might be not working anymore, and they actually only see the fruits, except maybe here this one image where one patient in this case was detecting still a face, but all the others, they were just not seeing any face at all. So that's just a hint that if these mechanisms are going wrong, it also has implications for certain disease states, and understanding those better, it might be useful in treating different diseases, like schizophrenia is another interesting disease where you have a lot of communication apparently going on. So how can we do such flexible computation? And that's an active field, I would say, that is discussed in various ways. One mechanism that is proposed is based on collective neural oscillations. And here is some sort of history, a review on that. So neural oscillations, I thought it was quite interesting, but I have to go a bit faster, but I wanted to give you that information. So historically, neural oscillations were discovered here by Hans-Joachim Berger, who had an event where I guess him or a friend of him, I forgot, but where he got a terrible accident, and his sister miles away kind of sensed that and rushed to help him. So he couldn't understand how that could happen, and I guess nobody could understand can understand this today, but that triggered his interest in studying brain, in particular seeing does the brain emit any interesting waves. So he found these like oscillations that nowadays are very highly studied, basically macroscopic or mesoscopic dynamical state in the brain where a lot of neurons doing the same thing. And if you put an electrode on your head, you see these oscillations down here. It's interesting, this perfect oscillation down here, it's so old that at that time there were no computers. You had to run like a sine wave down here as a second marker to measure time, basically, with these measurements. So it's kind of the bit background on neural oscillations. But there's a big discussion in the field that tries to say, yeah, what are these oscillations? Are these just an epiphenomenon? Is this just the steam of the engine of the brain? Because we have excitatory and inhibitory neurons, negative feedback always generates oscillations in some way. This could be just the steam of the engine. It's just natural that it arises. It has no further meaning. What counts is, let's say, the spikes or firing rates, etc. Other field or other parts, other scientists think that maybe actually these oscillations have actually quite lots of functions, from learning and what we see today, so information routing and coordinating maybe certain processes in the brain. So this question is still, like, I would say, under debate. Maybe nowadays it tends more to the functional properties side, but yeah, some people were often even ignoring any oscillatory activity in the brain when they analyze their data. Why could oscillatory activity be particularly interesting? There's this famous communication through coherence hypothesis, CTC, by Pascal Fries, initially developed or put forward. This hypothesis basically states the following. Assume we have two brain areas here, red and blue, and they undergo some oscillatory activity, and this is in a certain frequency band. This is coherent, meaning that the frequency is kind of stable and very similar in both regions. And now there's a certain phase alignment between these that's kind of fixed. In this case here, we have these spikes again, and I plotted these oscillatory states, which is often called LFP. It's kind of an average measure of the activity if you want to be very crude. And then if this average activity measure is high, of course, you get a lot of spikes in your neurons. Now, if these spikes are sent out to the postsynaptic group, the blue group here, and that group itself undergoes this oscillation and in the state of high activity, it's much easier to trigger spikes. In the postsynaptic side, these cells are much easier to generate new spikes. And in this case, we kind of push this information through. While in contrast, if your phase aligns in a bad way, where your spikes arrive here, ignoring, let's say, any time delays, etc., your spikes arrive here in the trough where the activity is very low. It's very difficult to elicit a spike because the neurons are not like highly excited, and it takes some input currents to make them spike. So many of these input spikes might just get lost, and the information is not necessarily transmitted. And interestingly, so that's the hypothesis. Interestingly, people like Timo Wommelsdorf, but many others now also have found, for example, that indeed, if you would measure, for example, here, correlations between the input and output spike patterns, or between two areas, in this case, they measured from a monkey brain and some visual cortex area, I think, you see that if you condition on various coherent oscillatory states in these two areas, and then you measure the phase difference, and then for different phase difference, you measure the correlation. You indeed see this like up and down here. There's some optimal phase difference that's always aligned to pi, so don't worry about that. But that has no meaning because of conduction delays and so on. But there's definitely certain phase differences where you get like much higher correlation than in others, giving some sort of evidence or some indication that there's maybe something to this theory people talk about.
What's correlation?
Follow-up studies. Sorry, there was a question maybe?
Yeah, what do you mean by correlation?
Oh, here, this correlation measure. Basically, they just look at like, in this case, they look at like for this multi-unit activity, how well is that, let's say, a spike pattern here? Often it's convolved with some sort of Gaussian. How is that spike pattern correlated with the spike pattern down here in this other group, if that makes sense? But that's conditioned on all the data where you are in an oscillatory coherent state with a certain phase difference, and then that will give you 1 point here. And now you condition on a different phase difference, and you get a higher power correlation, if that makes sense.
It sort of does, and this is, so you're not actually just measuring correlation itself, it sounds like. And now these 60 hertz bands, how common is it to have different frequencies in the signals?
Oh yeah, okay. So that's a very good question. Actually, if you look into the literature on the brain, there's several different bands of frequencies that are important or that are observed over and over again, which highly depends on the brain area you are in. It also highly depends on the animal behavioral state. For example, these are quite high oscillations, 60 hertz bands. They're like gamma range called. Those are thought to be promoting bottom-up information processing or information routing patterns. They are lower frequencies, alpha or delta or something, that are more like in 8-10 hertz, who promote maybe top-down influences in the brain. So all these things could also happen at the same time. So there are several bands. In sleep, you get additional very, very slow oscillations. For example, when rats run in mazes in the hippocampus, there's a very prominent theta rhythm around 11 hertz or 10 to 12 hertz that is active only if the rat is running. So these oscillations come and go. And even, for example, also in bats, it's not always a single frequency. In certain animals, like this theta rhythm, is very constant. But for example, in bats, if they fly, and people have measured while flying, you see actually that the frequency can change from quite fast to much lower over the course of behavior. So there's some sort of modulation of that frequency itself. It gets stretched and crunched in some way, maybe to adapt to the difficulties of coordinating flying. We don't know, but that's quite an interesting finding too. So these oscillations are not even constant over time necessarily. So it's quite a complex system. Often you have also cross-frequency coupling. So if you see a lower frequency wave, you often get on the top of that wave, you get a higher frequency gamma wave that like only appears on the top of it. So that's all. It's quite, if you look into the detail, it's quite complex. So here, for simplicity, they focus on the 60 hertz band as kind of a gamma range or gamma oscillatory range, which seems to be the frequency that's relevant in the area where they were measuring in the cortical areas. That frequency is kind of important.
So we should think of like the underlying hardware. Should we be thinking of a single neuron spiking at several different frequencies at the same time, or these different bands?
Oh no, sorry, maybe that was unclear. So the LFP is like a local field potential. You can, in a very crude way, view that as some sort of average activity signal. So these neurons, they often, particularly in cortical areas, this picture is maybe a bit misleading, just a sketch in cortical areas for a certain frequency. These neurons would only spike like every 10 oscillations in some random fashion. So they're not necessarily contributing to every oscillation, but on average on the population, you get these like organized oscillations. The oscillations themselves in the hippocampus are much more organized, and there it would look maybe more like this, where many neurons participate in each cycle and spike basically once, or generate even entire bursts during one cycle, if you want.
Okay. No, that makes sense. It means that the neurons they are individually not at this little frequency, but they're on phase with respect to that particular frequency.
Yes.
And the hypothesis here is that when, I guess, a batch of neurons connected to another batch of neurons, when they're in the same phase or somehow related phase modulo propagation delay, they are chemically, it's easier to push signal.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And so, like, are there studies like now? Is that the explanation at the neuronal level, or is it like this is what the research is heading?
Yeah, that's the explanation people like, or this is what this hypothesis is based on. I don't think there's like direct evidence in some way. I mean, you can do stimulation experiments and see at which time, if there's an oscillation that I inject a current, I can see how easy it is to elicit spikes, etc. So you can measure those things, and they would fit that model as well. But I don't think there's like really full proof that this is like this is more seen as a hypothesis, and then people often use more like these indirect measures of measuring correlation or other measures of information flow to see if such a hypothesis is true or not in the brain.
Got it. Yeah,
that makes sense. And at this stage, so when we entered, there's people do simulations, but little like theoretical modeling on this. So that's actually what my talk is about today, to maybe better understand potential mechanisms here for such information routing mechanisms, to just like make better predictions and better understand what are possible ways of organizing, let's say, information flow in neural networks. Yeah, so that brings me to the question now. And you asked perfectly, like here, there's just a random correlation measure, and that's true. So how can we measure like information flow, or let's say at least information sharing? Some people, one has to be quite careful with the term flow, etc. But here, for simplicity, we constrain ourselves to two measures to measure how two brain areas here, red and blue again, how those might interact in a certain way. And in general, there are two different ways of approaching this. One is like doing certain regressions, so building small, simple models about how X is influencing Y or how Y is influencing X, and then look for these regressions and see if there are any statistical significant influences, and those would then tell you, oh, Y is actually influencing X. And like maybe people have heard of Granger causality or dynamic causal models, they all fall in this category. There's like a more model-independent approach that's a bit easier to deal with, maybe mathematically sometimes. That's based on simple information theoretic measures that are called delayed mutual information and transfer entropy. And we will go this route because the analytics in this case are slightly easier, and also it's a bit more general in the sense that it's model-independent. So for delayed mutual information, what we do, we just take two time points here, from the two different areas, a Y time point and an X time point with some delay D. That's why we call it delayed mutual information. We take all the pairs of that we can get from our recordings or from our model or from our stochastic process. And then we calculate the joint probability of those and compare this with the, basically the probability if both processes were independent. And the way of comparison here is, we can talk about detail later, but just to make it quick, just some sort of difference measure in probability space, the Kullback-Leibler divergence. If you insert that, you get this expression over here. You can also rewrite that as a difference of two entropies. One is just the entropy of X itself. How difficult is it to encode that signal X? And then the other one is the conditional entropy. How difficult is it to encode X given that I know Y? If Y perfectly predicts X, that entropy is 0 and my mutual information is maximal. It's the entropy of that signal. If Y is not predicting X at all, this term here is the same as the initial entropy, and basically there's no mutual information. And the curves that we get, they look something like this, where there's often like a peak for a certain delay, and that maybe indicates a certain directionality of the information flow. They're usually not 0 on either side, so that is because of certain ways how you can generate artifacts in that measure. For example, if you had correlations, autocorrelations in time here, then even though maybe X, even though Y is physically only influencing X because of the temporal correlation, maybe I can draw that here, I don't know if it's possible. If I had another, no, that was the wrong. Yeah, if you had another signal here and you had autocorrelations between these signals over here, then even if Y is influencing X, you have correlations in this direction. But because of the autocorrelation, you will also detect some correlations here in this direction, or that the same is true for mutual information. You will also detect some mutual informations here. So that's why you often get non-zero values over here. So to account for that, people have introduced transfer entropy, which may be better called just conditional mutual information if you wanted to, and I think other people have introduced that before. In any case, in this case, you condition on top of the current state here of X to basically exclude these effects of the autocorrelation within the same signal. And that gives you transfer entropy, and that often has much more cleaner, for a physical system that's coupled in one direction, has basically 0 on one side and then non-zero on the other. Yeah. Okay. That's one part to measure basically connectivity in our systems. Now, the second part is you also want to model the neural populations. And we choose a very simple model because it lets us do some analytics here. It's called the Wilson-Cohen neural oscillator. This oscillator basically captures a small population of neurons. One part is excitatory, indicated here as triangles, and one part is inhibitory, and these are mutually coupled. So the excitatory neurons project onto the inhibitory neurons. They also have couplings among each other, which are not drawn here, but then the inhibitory ones also couple among each other, but then also project back the inhibition on top of the excitatory system. And as explained before, if you have some sort of negative feedback here, and because of the actual positive feedback of the excitatory system, if you inject enough currents, then the excitatory system here will increase its activity for a while. Sorry, it should be the lighter one, increased activity. Now this activity of the excitatory loop goes up. We excite our inhibitory population that then shuts down the excitatory activity. And then no excitatory activity is driving inhibition anymore. Inhibition goes down again, and then the cycle starts from new. The feedback within the excitatory group is enough to generate basically the next cycle. And this is a very common mechanism for generating neural oscillations in the brain. That's why this model is quite famous in modeling neural oscillations, basically. The equations are quite simple. The equations are quite simple. Over here, we add some additional noise to make it stochastic, so to say. But otherwise, yeah, we have some sort of activation function G here that can be derived from the underlying network model to get these, what people call also mean field equations in this case. You can view this as a mean field approach. Okay, to make our lives even a bit simpler, we go one step further and just see if I can get my mouse back. I guess not. It's okay. Can you see my red dot, or is it difficult?
No, we can't see it.
Okay. Could you see my mouse before?
It's oh, now we see it.
Great. Okay, so to make our lives even a bit simpler, as I explained before, we get these like neural oscillations, and people have estimated parameters for these models, etc. So we can build on previous work quite nicely. I think I cited it here, for example, by Sompolinsky, initial work by Wilson Cohen. But to make our life slightly easier for certain analytics and to understand things a bit better, we do what is called a phase reduction. So we describe the system. If it's oscillating like this, there will be in phase space some sort of periodic orbit, and we basically introduce a phase. We just pick one random point and say this is zero phase, and then along the limit cycle, we say that the phase increases uniformly in time from 0 to 2 pi until you get back to the same point on the limit cycle. And then you can extend that phase into the space by just, if you are attractive limit cycle, you will start, let's say, here from the blue spot, and you will just run into the towards the limit cycle. And if you take t to infinity, at some point you will hit some phase that would be the same as if you started on the limit cycle at the same time. So that phase can be assigned here, and this way you can extend the phase into the at least surrounding or the basin of attraction of this periodic orbit. And you can extract this phase with certain analytical methods, which is called phase reduction. I leave out the details, but happy to discuss this if people are interested. But that allows us to get basically a phase out of this in this model. And now we can start coupling these groups together, these oscillatory groups. We can still do the phase reduction and get a phase-reduced network model in this case. And the phase dynamics here, this is a very famous equation, often referred to as Kuramoto equation, where basically we just describe each of these oscillators with a single phase. They have some sort of intrinsic frequency with which they oscillate if they were not coupled. And then there will be like these coupling functions gamma that can be shown under certain conditions, particularly weak coupling in this case. Only depend on the phase difference here. And then the noise survives in certain ways. You can calculate that too, how you have to transform the noise to get from the original equations to this like more phase-reduced equations. Yeah, this system is very famous, has been, you can view this as when you're a physicist, as the standard model for synchronization, if you wish. Often then there's a sine term here inserted for this gamma function. And kind of the standard model people use to study any synchronization processes in networks and see how the network structure influences those and so on. If you know about Ginzburg-Landau theory, you can view this also as the phase part of that, or if you like normal form theory in some way, you could say that for multiple Hopf bifurcation, if all your oscillators are close to Hopf bifurcation, can transform this to a normal form, and the phase part of that normal form also is this exact equation over here.
All right, so to make sure I get this, because this seems cool. So it's, I mean, I'll take this to a different system. It sounds like you have a system that operates according to a particular cycle. So it could be a star during its entire 10 billion year cycle. All you're doing is saying that such a star, here's its first billion, second billion, third billion, because it's a standard progression. I don't care about its internal, the values of internal details is how far along is it in the cycle. If I put two such stars together and now they're, is there a phase lock between their evolutions? Maybe yes, maybe not, but that would be the analysis.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the advantage of these methods here. It's kind of semi-trivial because almost trivial because the system itself is only two-dimensional. But you could start with a much more complex oscillator, and that's where this method becomes more and more powerful. If you then use this phase reduction method, there are certain mathematical constraints. So the biggest constraint is that the attraction towards that, you have this stable limit cycle, and the attraction towards your limit cycle is reasonably strong. Under that assumption, no matter how complex your oscillatory system is, you can always reduce it to a phase model here. And then if these oscillators couple in a weak enough way, again, weak enough here in comparison to the attraction to the limit cycle, so that you still stay close to that. If the interaction would bring you far off, you have no chance, of course. So that's a critical assumption. But if that assumption is fulfilled, then you can use this phase reduction and describe quite complex systems in this quite simple equations. And that's the power of this, like, Kuamoto equations, if you want. And that's why so many physicists like to study that, because a lot of systems can be reduced to a certain extent to that. Does that answer your question?
It does. So it sounds like if you have, let me give you another system. Two people, they have their health age, not their biological age. And now if you have two different people in different points in their age, you're not going to push them from a human to a dog, but it's definitely going to be somewhere in the human age. And if you have people who are, differently at different ages, maybe the older person starts exercising and starts getting biologically younger, but still only within that one progression. So it's only their biological health that you're going to progress on. You're never going to leave the manifold.
Yeah, right. I mean, for the people, maybe more like a daily cycle or something. It has to usually to introduce a phase. I mean, you could probably generalize that. You could generalize that and not introduce a phase, but more like a progression variable. I think then you could actually do the same. So that makes sense. Right. Yeah.
A bunch of people are out of phase for their dinner time, and you're definitely going to have dinner once a day. And now it's the timing of the dinner time based on the difference in your normal original dinner times.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. That makes sense.
I think one example I know where people might have used this is for modeling. So it's known that the menstruation cycle for women is synchronizing if they live together in certain close enough groups, like certain tribes or something like that. So there you can actually model that also with similar models here. People have tried to model that. So that might be.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have all the ingredients together. We have our ways to measure information flow. We have some simple phase models we can work with that are inspired by or based on actual neuroscientific models for neural oscillations. So now we want to just measure a bit like what happens in these systems. And this is here our initial work on this, where we found some quite interesting results. So we kept everything very simple. We just used here two Wilson cone oscillators coupled. We extracted the phase here, and I told you that we inject these noises. This might be the stimuli to the system that come from external other brain areas or from sensory inputs, etc. So that's why we see these fluctuations here. And that allows us to calculate these distributions. We need to calculate the mutual information measures. And in this case here, here I only plot the phase difference in this case. These systems often show phase locked state. Interestingly, if you just insert the parameters from the neuroscientific community that were estimated for these models from the Sompolinsky paper I mentioned earlier, we get phase locked states in this case. So we can concentrate on one state here. I call this alpha. We look at that state. We look at basically the phase dynamics and the distribution, and we calculate our, in this case, let's say, delayed mutual information measure. And what we see is this orange curve here. Here is the 0 here in the middle, and we see that this peak is kind of shifted to one side. And if you translate that back to like what it maybe means, which area is influencing which area more, we see that this can be interpreted that this, in case the light green areas is influencing the dark green area a bit more. And now here, what I didn't say so far is that this system is completely symmetric. So there, all the coupling here between the groups has physically the same connectivity strength. So there is no preference in one direction. In some sense, this phase lock state seemed to break the symmetry of the system. It falls in one symmetry broken state. Some people might get reminded of like Higgs boson type of mechanisms. So you fall into one symmetry broken state, and that state then gives you this symmetry broken information routing pattern in one direction. But because of overall symmetry in the system, of course, we have the same state where the roles of the oscillators is just reversed. And in this case, this just indicates another pattern in which the information is now flowing in the other direction of this system. So this is, I think, the key insight. If you only get this from the talk, I think that's basically all our following ideas and theory and so on are based on this simple idea. Depending on which state you are in, you can basically route information in different ways if you wanted to. And there's no change in physical connectivity. We have no learning or anything. It's really a fixed physical system. Just by preparing different initial states in which you put these oscillatory regimes, you can easily switch from one to another way of routing information. And that might be extremely attractive for, let's say, a brain circuit that has to do many things and has to switch quite fast between different tasks and so on, to maybe do different things at once by just switching the dynamical state to another regime, and suddenly you can do something completely different in this case. Because of time, I will skip maybe the details. I'm happy to talk about the underlying math and why that works. We also measure the transfer entropy here, and the results are much clearer. It's like one directional coupling in this case, and we also have a good explanation for that. I'm happy to talk about this in the discussion, but let me just give you some examples of how this looks like. So, for example, I take this, it's a bit nicer or more intuitive. For example, we have some signal, and we have some additional context signal that's underlying it that generates like this total input. And we can call this maybe a context signal, and then this the information signal. If we feed that in and we prepare our system in the way that, in this case, the information routing is in the opposite direction, what we get as output here or here is just a flat line. It's just the noise we inject in the second oscillator, basically. It doesn't notice this input texture, if you wish. But now, because of this jump here, the system is now pushed into the basin of attraction of the other dynamical state, and suddenly the motif is flipped here automatically, so to say, as a response to this jump in activity. And now the routing goes in the other direction, and then suddenly the system is starting to track this texture or the actual signal. And now if you turn off the context signal, the system in this case jumps back to the other state and the tracking is out. So in this case, you can see maybe from this introductory example, this could be kind of an interesting mechanism to explain these effects where you have routing, and then in another condition, a different context condition, this routing is completely shut off, and you route maybe to another area that's also coupled in a different way in this case. But just like to turn off a signal that kind of matches maybe quite well in this case. There's one example. We have more like model examples where we can feed in like controlled signals here, and then we can prepare, in this case, a 3 oscillatory system in different dynamical states. 2 oscillators still have the very same effect as before. We can, in this case, just switch the information routing motif, and the second oscillator is switched to the other side. So then what we get is just gating of the input we feed into the blue oscillator in this case. Or if we turn it around, then we get gating 2. If we feed both, we even get the sum of both. So depending on the underlying state of this dynamical state of this physical identical system, we can do different operations in parallel or switch between them depending on this state. So this gives quite high flexibility in the same physical network in some way. Okay, so that's the basic. Oh, sorry, yeah. What's that question? I'm sorry, I can't see anyone because of the screen.
Yeah, I do have one. So I'm noticing that this is, I'm thinking as computer science or logical networks, it's not the same, but has some of the same flavors. So I'm noticing you can choose whether to couple, you can alter the direction of information flow. What I'm not getting is what information can you propagate?
What information?
Can you propagate? Is it
well, I mean,
space or something else?
Yeah, so in this case, we just feed in these like, here it's just chosen in the beginning to be like more like a representation of like in steps that are more close, as you said, to computer science, to sell this more to a computer science community. But you could also feed like more noise-like signals, and then you get the sum of the noise here, or you gate noise 1 or 2. So because it's based on information theory, there's no, as long as these signals are not pushing you out of the actual dynamical state the system needs to produce the routing pattern, as long as the signals are small enough, you can feed basically anything you want. The only other condition, so the question is very good. One condition is there that maybe you're not going much faster than the oscillation frequency of the system itself. For example, if you go above that, then it might be harder to read out reliably the information later in this case. Yeah, you have to imagine that this is all oscillating. So here, actually, the output is already removed the underlying reference state, the oscillatory state in some way. And that might be harder if your signal kind of is close to that oscillation frequency, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. But now why so why would you want to propagate noise? Are there additional kinds of information propagation signals where the shape of noise affects stuff? Because right now it's just the phasing that or directionality that I've seen, in this example.
Yeah. No, I don't want to necessarily propagate noise, but in neuroscience, for example, often inputs that are not known are just, as always in physics, I guess, is modeled as some sort of noise that comes in, sensory flow. But ideally, I agree, it would be interesting to make this more concrete. And for example, I'm not sure if we get there today, but for example, apply these ideas to more concrete systems. For example, what I could imagine would be like a scene recognition device where you have different networks that detect certain objects and can if once they detect those, can propagate that information to higher order areas that then make sense out of it, maybe track these things. Or if you have a 3D scene but only 2D information, maybe inform about hiding certain things. So if, for example, visual information could be quite an interesting application, but we haven't done that so far.
So then let me hypothesize a particular coupling mechanism. If the noise, let's say, is another sine wave that operates at twice the frequency, let's say, that's noise. Then it might be another oscillator that operates at that frequency, and now, let's say, the recipient, batch of neurons can now appropriately communicate with that thing, because now their frequencies are coupled, whereas normally there was no connection.
Right. Yeah. That's. I think that's a good point you're mentioning. So there's another work by Itzikevich actually where they try to establish connectivity based on resonance, which are you probably referring to. So if you're kind of matching in frequency, let's say, well, then the areas start to synchronize, and that's a way to open the communication channel. Here, I think we are. It doesn't have to be, but in these examples, it's always like a global phase-locked oscillatory state, and the deviations are small. So the oscillators are all oscillating with roughly the same frequency in the system, and then they're just deviating from that. And these deviations are these signals these signals drive these deviations, and they're small enough to not kick you out or induce any of these resonance effects that have also been proposed to flexibly bind certain areas together, or certain groups of oscillators together to make them act as a single group. And those theories have even been proposed by Christoph von der Malsburg and others. It's called binding by synchrony. If you have different neurons representing different information, now when they start to synchronize, they bind together information of the object being red and spherical. So then if they fire together, if these neurons synchronize, it means you're seeing a red sphere. Those things have been proposed. Our mechanism, I think, is slightly different because we are looking at the deviations from an underlying reference state in this case. So we don't necessarily have these resonance effects there. Or we haven't looked into those, what that means. For us, the system is globally rotating, let's say, in this reference state. And then on top of that reference state, it's deviating a bit like frequency modulation or amplitude modulation way, and that's what's carrying the information, and that's also that decides where the information is routed in these systems, if that makes sense.
So it's actually interesting. I was literally going to bring that up. It sounds like we've been talking about frequency modulation for establishing high throughput channels effectively in a neural network. I'm trying to decode from your talk the computational hardware that you're discovering here, right? So you do frequency modulation to do what neural networks do with attention, connect this thing to that thing. And then it sounds like there might be an amplitude modulation to shape the signal that is actually being propagated along this connection.
Right. And maybe because of the sake of time, I skip over some things here briefly to go directly to your question. So we have actually something like that built, or initial model, basically exactly what you're saying. So what we did here is we just went one level up. So instead of coupling groups together, we now also, we have those groups still, but on top we couple like them in a hierarchical network. So we have different modules, like different sub-networks, so to say, of oscillators that act together. And then what we do here is that this system will arrange in some global dynamical state. And that global dynamical state, depending on how the system arranges, will determine how the information, let's say, from this green area is routed to other areas. So let's say in this case here, the green area propagates that information. Now, if we had a way to tune the system in some way that it organizes its reference dynamics on top of which the information is routed in such a way that, let's say, when the green area is doing really well, let's say in terms of measuring a loss function, like what's the loss in that area, right? Is that is the system very close to performing very well, or is it far from, the loss is extremely high, is it far from optimal? Then you could actually use that as local feedback here. That would change the oscillation frequency, let's say, of this group in some way. That will rearrange the global global dynamical state of the entire network. And in this case, let's say if the system performs very well, it will arrange in a way that this information is actually distributed to other networks as useful context, because I'm performing well. My loss is very much lower than the other network's losses. Now, if that situation changes, of course, if suddenly another network, either the input changes or the computation is in red is faster, red becomes better, then ideally these local feedback mechanisms should drive your system so that this information is distributed in to the other areas that perform less. And indeed, we implemented exactly what you said. So we took a Hopfield network that maybe people of you have heard of. It might be hard to introduce that in detail, but basically a Hopfield network is a pattern recognition system in which you can have a rule in which you can define your coupling weights in some sort of firing rate model, if you wish, so that whenever you're close to one of these given patterns, you will converge to that. So it's closely related to Ising models, etc. So now you can have 3 of those networks and you couple them together and introduce also a way of saying, oh, if I detect a certain pattern here, this blue upper stripe pattern, I want a bias detection of this upper triangle in the second area, because I don't know, whenever, if you want to interpret it as a scene, whenever there's a truck coming, there might be it might be honking or something. I don't know, whatever these like abstract patterns actually mean. Or if there's one part in the image, then maybe a certain feature of that image always towards the left follows, I don't know, from an edge, there's always a corner or something you can think about in these things as well. Here it's very abstract, just patterns that influence each other. And now we do exactly what you said. So we keep the Hopfield dynamics in the amplitude part, and then we add a phase dynamics that regulates how these systems interact in specific ways. And maybe for time, I skip the details, but basically it's just doing exactly what, if you work it out, basically, it's exactly doing this. If your loss is low, in this case, loss means distance to one of the stored patterns. The closer you are to one pattern, the better you perform, the lower your loss. Then that drives the oscillation frequency in this system, and using standard Kuramoto synchronization dynamics, if that oscillator, let's say, is driven faster, it will advance in the phase slightly with respect to the other groups that don't advance as much. And then the coupling function is chosen in the way that exactly provides the context information of the best performing group. And here's an example simulation. I start with some patterns here and then run it. In the end, we find a coherent interpretation of the scene, let's say. And we see in this case here, how confident are my networks? So this is kind of the inverse loss, if you want. The green network is already from the beginning, for certain reasons, quite confident in what pattern it's detecting. The blue one is in the middle, and the red is kind of performing worse. And then because everything is simulated, we can actually measure also how much of these context connections are actually used dynamically. And we see that here positive usage means that red receives a lot of context from other areas. Blue is in the middle, receives some information and also provides some information to the red area. And green is only negative, meaning it's distributing its information towards the other networks. So in this case, this is kind of a very toy example of what you were asking. Namely, how can we use this? And here's maybe one nice example where these networks, you don't have to program that anymore. In some sense, the networks figure out in a self-organized way, these networks are figuring out what's the best configuration in order to distribute my information. How am I performing in contrast to other networks? And is it better to shut down my broadcasting of my information, or is it better to transmit it?
So that's really interesting. But I didn't get the last points. I get how you can design such a signal recognition engine from a bunch of sub-networks that look for edges, stripes, all these little sub-patterns. And I can see how you can, design by hand the right pattern. But it sounds like you're saying they can also learn from, and like, I don't see a back propagation mechanism or whatever. Like, is there a mechanism where the pattern is most stable, where it's most right, or something like that?
Right, that's a great question, and that's one question I'm working with Tianhao Zhang from Minnesota University, who did like an internship or had like a fellowship to do a summer project with me at the Lawrence Berkeley lab. So we're actually trying to look into learning mechanisms in general, maybe not in this particular concrete system, though it would be also interesting, but also in general, how can we learn anything on top of these dynamical reference states? So if we take this theory seriously, maybe I have a slide somewhere. Yeah, very small slide here, but maybe I can. Yeah, I can only describe it. But the idea basically is, how can we, if we have a reference, I have a slide actually to illustrate. So we have this trajectory, which is made out of a reference state and the information carrying deviation from that. So how can we have any learning rule or learn a system that learns to do something interesting in such a setting? So for that, actually, we worked on one idea that comes from a simpler question, just how can I learn these reference states in neural networks? And that there's lots of work, of course, but one work that is more dynamical systems oriented is this force learning that was invented by Larry Abbott and David Sosillo, which is basically based on recurrent least squares. So we took this force learning, and this would be an entire another talk, but we took this force learning and generalized the recurrent least squares from other people's work that developed the tensor recurrent least squares. So we call this tensor force. And that learning mechanism allows you to do both, to learn a reference trajectory as well as to learn basically, in this case, an operator around that reference trajectory. So it tells you like, what is the noise doing around this reference trajectory? And that's, at this point, this is a linear operator, so it's relatively simple, but at least we're able to learn like a system that performs a certain operation around a reference state. And on top of it, we're also able to learn multiple reference states at the same time using this tensor property of this tensor recurrent least squares algorithm itself. Yeah, that was a crash course into that, but it maybe connects to your question, like how can we learn to it? I don't think I have a full answer to that, but this is like a first step towards thinking about learning algorithms. And you're right, backpropagation is definitely not working in this case because, yeah, we already have this like clear separation between dynamics and deviations, and simple backpropagation is not going to solve this, unfortunately. Yeah, it's a good question. Are there enough benefits to learn multiple things at once and have this flexibility, where there's sticking with very well-established learning methods like backpropagation that work extremely well these days, right? So yeah, that our approach is more brain inspired. We just want to know if such mechanisms are present in the brain. Can they also be learned in certain ways? So far, we don't know if this learning algorithm is like biologically realistic. It's quite interesting because you do a lot of stuff in parallel instead of just learning sequentially. For example, one task after another. You can learn multiple tasks at once here. So that would be interesting to see if any of these mechanisms are working in the brain or not. We don't know, but it could be an interesting direction to investigate further.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much. Are there call? Wait, actually, Farouk has a question. Please. You are muted.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a question about the mechanics of doing these simulations. When you're simulating these systems, how many neurons are you generally simulating, and what kind of neuron model? And then my second question was, how fragile or stable are these oscillatory states?
Good question. Yeah, let me see. Okay, I just go back. Yeah, sorry, I can't see you, but I think it's fine. That's a great question. So in terms of the number of neurons, so we have for the simple Kuramoto systems, let's say, we have analytical results that only maybe need the reference state, which is phase locked state, which you can calculate by looking at zeros of certain coupling functions, if you wish. So you can do that very reliably numerically, and they're as long as you stay in these regimes of, let's say, phase locking, we can do everything analytically, so we don't have to simulate. But you're right. So at some point, we want to see if this maybe works also with more realistic networks. So we have done simulation. So there, the number doesn't matter. It's more the condition on, like, more towards your second question, more towards the condition, how stable are these states? And that's actually a property of all the connectivity in the network and the dynamical properties of the oscillators. So for that, one would need to map out the Bayesian of attractions of these different states, and that can be quite cumbersome and quite difficult to predict or figure out. Like what we see when we use our simple models here, so to say, the Bayesian of attractions for at least smaller networks are relatively stable in the sense. It takes quite some efforts to push one into another state. So that's kind of a good sign. Of course, if you scale this up to hundreds, let's say, of oscillators, you get more and more potential states in the system. And those might actually shrink your Bayesians of attraction, right? So in that case, you have to reduce the noise, the amplitude of the information carrying noise, let's say, so that you not get pushed out. So that's a fine balance. And I think it's hard to, I mean, you could do like big numerical scans and so on. One could ask the value of that. For certain, if you design things well, let's say, you can achieve good stability for certain states. And this force learning I mentioned also goes in the same direction. There, the learning mechanism itself actually stabilizes certain reference states very well. And that learning has been shown to work very well. So stability also is achieved. That's the feature of this learning algorithm that basically provides like high stability of the reference states you're learning. So we hope that maybe in those systems where we learn things, where we start out with a blank screen, so to say, and not engineer our things, we might even get better stability for the right reference states that we want to learn. I don't know, does that kind of answer your question?
That does, thank you.
Okay, I think I should just before I forget, because often it gets too late and then it's terrible. I should briefly, is this the right talk? I guess not. 1 second. Where did I put it? I should thank my sponsors and my collaborators who helped me with this project, or which we worked together. So I just want to put this slide up so that we have, and then, yeah, initially, the initial theory we worked out with Damian and Mark, Tim at the Max Planck Institute, and then I did a follow-up study with Marcelo Magnasco and Carl at Rockefeller University. And then now I didn't have the chance to talk about it. We actually implement some of these ideas in neuromorphic shifts, which I work with Ran Chang and Dilip Vasudevan. And then I mentioned Tianhao Zhang, who helped me with the learning and looked into what are possible learning mechanisms. And I also have to thank my institutions, the Kavli Foundation and the Department of Energy for funding. So thank you for that. And I'm happy to take more questions now. I just wanted to make sure.
Awesome. Yeah, are there any more questions on the call? Okay, I think, yeah, that this is fantastic. Thank you very much, Christoph.
Well, thanks you so much for having me. It's really an interesting series. I feel honored to be here. Thanks for for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely.